Thank you, Chris. We're continuing in our study. Did y'all get a book? Did somebody get all our visitors a book? Good. May not make any sense when I'm talking, but you got the book. You can read that. We've been talking about Numbers and all of the Exodus from Egypt and what they encountered when they got out in the desert. Brooks, I got some echoes or something here somewhere. So the Israelites complained, right? We talked about that last week. Every time they went somewhere or were going somewhere, they complained. And I think that's kind of like human nature, just complain to complain. I mentioned a guy named Ben in the National Guard, and he complained about every single thing we ever did. I mean, it didn't matter what it was. So I think they were kind of like that. And last week they complained about not having meat to eat. Well, they had cattle and they had sheep and stuff, but I don't know how much they had, but counting all the men that were conducted in the census, which is 600,000, and you add the men who were too old to be in the military, and that's what the whole purpose of that was, to have a military, men who were 20 years old and older who could fight. And then you add the women and the children and the old men and stuff, and most scholars figure that that number could have easily been 1.5 million people or more. And they complained about everything, and Moses was just at his wit's end. He didn't know how he was going to get any meat for them to eat, and he didn't even really, at some point, think that God was going to be able to supply it all, even though he'd seen all the miracles that he had done. So what did God do? He sent a big wind, and it blew in a bunch of quail. And there were so many quail that the Bible says it was 2 cubits deep. Now, a cubit's about 18 inches long, so 2 of them is 36 inches, 3 feet deep of quail on the ground, and it says it was as far as a day's walk in any direction. Now, how far can you walk in a day?
30 miles.
We did it in the Army too. They figured that would take 12 square miles to put all those people in. That's how big the group was. So they had quail that was 3 feet deep, and as far as you could see, as far as you could walk in a day, and it says that the people gathered no less than 10 homers. A homer was a measurement. That equals to about 1 3/4 tons of quail. I don't know if you've ever dressed a quail or a chicken, but that's a lot of work. It don't take long to do a quail. We used to do that back in the day when we had places we could actually hunt quail when you had fields, but now they're all subdivisions, right? But they had that many quail. But that wasn't enough. God punished some of them. He sent a plague that killed a lot of the people. They were always asking for more and more, and every time they get it, they were doing it out of disrespect to God. So after all of that took place, they went to a place called Hazeroth, and then Miriam and Aaron began to speak against Moses because of his wife. Now, who was Moses' wife? Zipporah. Did you ever watch the 10 Commandments? Charlton Heston and all that stuff, and they go out there and everything. Well, Zipporah was a Midianite. And the Midianites, if you go look far back enough in history, Midian was one of Abraham's grandsons, if I recall correctly, or somewhere back in that time. So they're all kinfolks. But they were complaining against Moses, but they were taking it out on Zipporah, his wife. And she was a Cushite, a Midianite, a Cushite. And the Cushite word technically referred to an Ethiopian. But it could also mean the word foreigner in this case. She was a foreigner. She was not a Hebrew Israelite. The real issue wasn't that they were mad at Moses because of Zipporah, was it? What was the real issue? They were just mad at Moses, their own brother. Since they could not find fault with him, they decided to attack somebody else, and it was his wife. So then God called all 3 of them to come to the tabernacle. And for those that don't know, that's a tabernacle, a rendering that they can figure it was so big and had all these different kind of posts, and the Levites took care of all of that. And there were some 8,000 Levites, so they had plenty of folks to help And they just bundled it all up and did what they had to do. So God called them all to the tabernacle, and he says, I speak to prophets in visions and dreams, but I speak to Moses personally, eye to eye. I don't talk to him. I don't send him a dream. I talk to him. He talked to Moses face to face. And when God's presence, his presence lived in the tabernacle, so the people could tell he was there. And after that, he left. The presence of God left the scene, and Miriam got leprosy. Now, what do we know about leprosy? Back in those days, it was pretty much deadly, and you had to be shunned off or somewhere. Remember, one of the islands in Hawaii was a leper colony, and one of the far little islands, they kept sending them all over there. So Moses, she struck down with leprosy, and Aaron, of course, seeing what's happening, he said, Moses, talk to God, help us out. So he did, and God said, okay, I'll relent, but she has to leave the camp for 7 days. They had the purification rituals, and if you go all the way back into Exodus and all these other things, it'll tell you all these different rules that they had to follow about their purification for this thing and that thing and whatever. And if they came in contact with a dead body, what they had to do and so forth. So she had to leave the camp for 7 days and go out and stay by herself somewhere in a tent or something. But the Israelites didn't move. They had to stay put for that period of time. So then what happened next was that God told Moses to send 7 spies into Canaan, one from each one of the tribes, to go out and see. And so we'll start today in Numbers 13:17, verse 17. When Moses sent them to scout out the land of Canaan, he told them, go up this way to the Negev, which was a desert, and then go into the hill country. See what the land is like, and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. Is the land they live in good or bad? Are the cities they live in encampments or fortifications? Is the land fertile or unproductive? Are there trees in it or not? Be courageous. Bring back some fruit from the land. It was the season for the first ripe grapes. So Moses sends out the 10 spies. He gave them specific instructions. Now, anybody remember watching the movie Band of Brothers? We all watched it, right? You know who Lewis Nixon was? He was Major Dick Winter's right-hand man. He was what they call the S2 officer, which was to gather intelligence on the enemy, whatever that is. They interrogated the prisoners and all that stuff, and they would figured out what the intelligence was so they would know their next military move, what they had to do. So he was their S2 officer. So Moses sent out 12 S2 men to scout the land, to find out what it was. In military terms, they were to reconnoiter the place, figure out what it was. They were to see what the land was like, what the terrain is like, how you traverse, where you get to where you're going. Whether the people were weak or strong, was the land fertile or not. God told them it was going to be the land. So this is the kind of the way they went. How they went up through the Negev desert and all up through the hill country. He wanted to know if the villages were little villages, or were they fortified cities with great big walls. Now some of the writers talk about some of the walls were like 20 feet thick this way and 20 to 25 feet tall. So that was a pretty serious place to try to attack, And they didn't have siege weapons like the Romans did back in their years later when they would build the big old towers and they would, attack a city. So Moses wanted specific information. Was it fertile land? Could it support all the people? And he wanted them to bring back grapes. He knew the time of year, so it was late summer, early fall, time to harvest the grapes. And so finding the answer was not going to be easy for them, would it? Now, they're 12 spies, right? World War II, if you ever watch any of the movies and you see what they did with the British, and they would send spies over to the Netherlands, or they would send spies to Belgium, or they would parachute them into France. What was the one thing they had to make sure they knew about? They had to know what clothes to wear. They couldn't wear British clothes, English clothes. They couldn't wear a watch that was an English watch. They had to make sure it was a French watch or whatever it was, and the clothes and style of the clothes and stuff they had to wear. So you imagine these 12 guys coming in, and pretty much if you don't have the facilities to go out and figure out what the other people are wearing, it's going to be something different, right? And the language, you know, they're not going to all speak the same language exactly, right? It's like when I was in the military, right? Well, I'm from the South. And some of the Yankees, bless y'all's hearts, just butchered the King's English. I had two guys from New Jersey. That's New Jersey, by the way. New Jersey. Had one from Boston, one from Chicago. You know, so it was terrible. My mother, when I came home, she said, just shut up, don't talk. You know, because there was only like two of us, let's see, four of us from the South. A guy from Covington and me, one from North Carolina and one from Mississippi or someplace, you know. So we were totally outnumbered. So even the languages, where they speak, and not just the same language, but how do they pronounce the words? Now, I told y'all a story years ago in AIT, had two guys. They were like 12 or 13, 14 of us in class. First guy in that corner, his name was Tom Barreca. And the last guy in that corner, his name was Al Zafaro. Okay? And when the officer would come in to teach the class, he would call the roll, and all he said was, Barreca. And he said, here, sir. And that's it. Went through all of us, and he figured out, and me and the Polk was a boy from Mississippi, and Tom Weaver from Alabama, you know, he knew we were from the South, but he didn't know where. Al Zafaro, here, sir. And Lieutenant Smith looked at him and says, you are from Brooklyn. And they both looked at him and said, yes, sir, and you're from Queens. They knew each other's accent across the city of New York. So these spies that Moses sent in, they had to deal with all kind of issues. They were foreigners. They could be easily recognized by their clothes, their habits, what they said, how they said it, and all kind of things. Moses told them to be courageous, be determined, do what you're supposed to do. Moses knew what information he needed, and he took steps to obtain it. And we need to do the same thing in our lives. When we're making decisions or taking on new responsibilities, there's two things we need to know about. One is what we need to know about the opportunity, and two, how to obtain it. Whatever we're doing in life, those two things. So then the next part of the chapters is in verse 21, and it talks about how they traveled as spies. It says, they went up and scouted out the land from the wilderness of Zin. Now there was wilderness of Sin, but that's not meaning sin, that's just the name of the place. And in the wilderness of Zin, and it went as far north as Rehob, which is on that little picture, near the entrance to Hamath. They went up through the Negev and came to Hebron, where I ain't even going to pronounce the name. The descendants of Anak were living. Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. When they came to the Eshcol Valley, they cut down a branch with a single cluster of grapes, which was carried on a pole by two men. So that, carried a pole, long, big bundle of grapes. They also took some pomegranates and figs. The place was called the Eshcol Valley because of the cluster of grapes the Israelites cut there. At the end of the 40 days, they returned from scouting out the land. So it tells about how the spies went up through the area. They went about as far north in Rehab and came back. That's about some 250, 300 miles total going up and back. So 40 days is what they traveled. Now, they went up through the Negev desert to Hebron. And if you think back, Abraham spent time there when he and Lot separated on their journey. There was just not enough land to feed all the flocks of sheep and cattle and whatever. So they split up. And so Abraham purchased a burial plot there, and for Sarah when she died. And then Abraham and Sarah and Isaac and Rebekah and Leah and Jacob were all buried in that cave there at Hebron. And years later, David would rule there at the beginning of his kingship for 7.5 years before he went to Jerusalem. So it's an important place. And around this time, the spies came into contact with the descendants of Anak. The Anakim were very large people compared to the Israelites. A lot of scholars think that Goliath was an Anakim. Later on, after the wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years, Joshua went back and they defeated the Anakim, and they moved out and they went to Gaza. You all know about Gaza in the news, and Gath and Ashdod, which is on the Mediterranean coast. And that's where the Philistines lived, along the coast. And who was the Philistine? Goliath. Okay. And Samson defeated a bunch of folks in the Philistines and all that. So the Anakim, a lot of people get hung up on the Nephilim, supposedly giants, you know, that were descendants of angels and women that they had married, you know, the angels that were kicked out of heaven and all that stuff. But most of the scholars think, well, that's even if it happened, they were all dead during the flood. So just big sized people. Now, watch any football games lately. You know, you look at a man, you think he's big at 6'2", 200 pounds, which is probably pretty good. 6'9", 340-pound lineman and stuff. You know, my chief of police played ball at Georgia. He was a big man. He was 6'2", or 3 or 4, about 250. He was a big man. Now he probably wouldn't even be a linebacker. You know, and you look at it, you see some of the refs out there running around. They're regular-sized people, but the football players are giants. And then you go to basketball players, and they're 7'5" and stuff. You know, so a lot of the scholars say they're just big people, and they were just, you know, not giants, just big compared to everybody else. Well, back in those days, I don't know how big a man technically was, but according to what I read, an average man in the United States nowadays is 5'9". I'm almost there. You know, so back then he might have been 5'4" or something. Who knows how big they were? But what happened when the spies came back? They what? Yeah, they were 2 against 10. It's like a jury, right? You got to have all unanimous, but they weren't unanimous. The men went back, verse 26, the men went back to Moses, Aaron, and the entire Israelite community in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back a report from them and the whole community, and they were showed the fruit of the land. They reported to Moses, we went into the land where you sent us. Indeed, it is flowing with milk and honey, which was a description of how great the land could be for agriculture. And here's some of this fruit. However, the people living in the land are strong, and the cities are large and fortified. We also saw the descendants of the Anak there. The Amalekites are living in the land of the Negev, the Hethites, the Jebusites, Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live by the sea and along the Jordan River. Then Caleb questioned the people in the presence of Moses and said, let's go up now and take possession of the land, because we can certainly conquer it. But the men who had gone up with him responded, we can't attack the people because they're stronger than we are. So they came back. They confirmed all the information that Moses wanted, but what happened to them? What were they dealing with more? Fear. They were afraid. They were overcome with fear. They described the cities as being large and fortified, 20 feet thick, 25 feet tall, and all that. Guards on top. The people were large and descendants of Anak. And then they reported about all these other people, all the ites. And I think one time I figured out from reading that there's like 156 different ites in the Bible. You know, these ites and those and so on and so forth. But Caleb wouldn't have anything to do with that. He questioned the people. He told them, yeah, we can do it. Because who did he have confidence in? The Lord. Not himself or not the people.
And they'd already brought all those quail, parted the Red Sea.
Yeah.
Gave them water out of a stone.
Uh-huh. And the miracle after miracle, and they still didn't believe.
What have you done for me today?
Yeah, that kind of thought. So they were to go against the crowd. Caleb and then Joshua also needed 3 things. He had to have the facts because he'd seen the land himself. He wasn't dependent on somebody else's description. He knew what he saw. He had to have the right attitude, which he believed that God to do that. He trusted God's promise to give Israel the land, and he stated clearly what he believed. Sound like somebody else in the last week or two almost, except the circumstances were a little bit different. Caleb was not so much as a man of great faith as he was in the faith of a great God. He knew what God had accomplished already, and he knew what he could. But the negative opinion of 10 men caused an entire rebellion by all the people. And we only count the 20-year-olds and older because that's who they counted for the army, for the census, who could fight if they needed to. And as a result, what happened? In that picture, they just wandered around in the desert for 40 years, you know, out there, stay here, do a day or two, stay there a month, whatever. Remember, they had the sheep and cattle and donkeys and everything. They had to feed them somewhere, so they had to find grass. You know, there's still nomads today in that part of the world, Saudi Arabia and places in northern Africa, and all they do is follow the grass and the water, you know, wherever it grows. You know, it's kind of like Native Americans did a lot of ways back in the old days. They would go from place to place, and they'd follow the grass and the buffalo. But no one over the age of 20 entered the promised land except Caleb and Joshua because of their faith in God. Now, what did the Israelites do? I think we'll talk about that next week some. They decided, okay, oh yeah, we can do it now. We're going to go do it. And Moses told them, you're not now, because God's not going to be with you. And what did they do instead? They went ahead and made their own decision and get up there and they're going to fight, and they got beat. So they come back. So all of this time, they've been gone now from Egypt for over a year, you know, and all these miracles, and they had food, manna every day. All they had to do was go out and pick it up and cook it and fix it up, whatever they had to do to it. You know, they didn't have to go to the grocery store, you know, and everything they had, water and miracles and everything. And they still didn't believe. They still were fear. And I think a lot of times in modern life, we're facing situations where we probably ought to do something, and we don't. We're afraid or whatever the case might be. So a lot of lessons we could learn from them as people of today, you know, just facing similar situations that we face. Not anything like having to worry about where the food is. Although there are lots of people in the world right now having to deal with that. I read an article about some of the poor people in Sudan. There's a place called the Darfur region, way over here on this part of the country of Sudan. And they're in a battle right now with these different groups, and the people are actually literally starving to death. And they're taking food that was meant for animals, and they're grinding it up and cooking it up and making some kind of paste and eating it. They go out and try to get grass and weeds and whatever they can get green to eat. And the women and their young girls are getting attacked and raped and killed. And the men who try to sneak out and go to places to find something are getting shot. That's just in one place, you know. And there's millions of folks there that have already fled that part of the world in Africa and Sudan. Two guys were going to take over the military. They got together, one group and a group. But then they got mad at each other and fell out, so now they're trying to kill everybody. So they're facing all kinds of things in the world even now. People starving in North Korea, have been ever since what's-his-name took over. You know, so people are facing the same problems lots of times all over the world. What we have for our benefit is that we know who God is and what he means to us. And although we have problems, we're not alone. You know, I told y'all last week, you know, that song, Just a Closer Walk with Thee, one of my favorite songs of all time. That second verse, if I falter, Lord, who cares? Who with me my burden shares? None but thee, Lord, none but thee. You know, everybody else might give up on us, but not God. Our question is, do we give up on God? I hope not. Anybody got anything they want to add today? Subtract? No. All right, if you'll close your eyes and bow your head, we'll have our closing prayer. Lord, thank you so much for this day you've given to us, and thank you for this lesson that we can learn that we need to trust you just like Caleb and Joshua did, no matter what the circumstances. We ask you to be with Matt as he brings a message today that it will touch our hearts. Be with us each and every day that we grow closer to you in our daily walk. We pray this in your name. Amen.